Hello, APUSHers. Today we're going to look at the rest of Chapter 16 on the West, about pages 505 to 516. This will be a review since most of your recitation folks have done the heavy lifting on this. Then tomorrow we will get into more specifics with industry and a new unit. So let's talk about this. You remember that yesterday we talked about two things. We talked about the myth of the West and why that's important. We also talked about land, and that land was the thing that kind of ties all the groups together that we're talking about. And we talked about native peoples yesterday. We talked about mining yesterday when we talked about the cattle frontier yesterday. Today I want to finish that up and talk about farmers. And in that, I want to begin by looking at three laws that are passed by the first Congress without the southern states during the Civil War. This is the Congress of 1862. And there are three laws that are passed that are really important for farmers during this time period. The first is the Homestead Act, the second is the Railway Act, and the third is the Morrill Land Grant Act. And so let's talk about those first, and then we'll talk about how they affect farmers. The first one, the Homestead Act, affected people the most directly. This is the act that will provide for to encourage people to head west and give them 160 acres of free land, provided that they live on the land for 5 years and they improve it. And this improvement gets back to that myth of the West, civilization versus nature, that we talked about yesterday. Improvement meant to control the land somehow. Now, of course, there were lots of folks that took advantage of this, lots of corporations that took advantage of that. We're going to lay that conversation aside for right now and talk about just the act itself and what it did. So what it did was, beginning even during the Civil War, encouraged thousands of people, families, to come west with the prospect of free land. This was a hugely generous offer by the federal government and was pretty unprecedented worldwide at that time. The second act that was passed was the Railway Act, and this was to provide funds in various ways to build the Transcontinental Railroad. That first Transcontinental Railroad will be completed in May of 1869 with the joining of the rails at Promontory Point, Utah. But this provided some incentive for companies to do that, and of course leads to, as we'll talk about in the next chapter, the largest scandal, political scandal in all of U.S. history, the Credit Mobilier scandal. And we'll talk more about that. The third piece of legislation that's important here is the Morrill Land Grant Act, and our very own Colorado State University is part of that, established in 1870. Go Rams! And what this did was gave money to establish agricultural and mining colleges throughout the West. So taken as a group, these three things give incentive for people to get out to the West, a way for people to get out to the West, and then training once they get to the West on how to be in the West. That's the idea behind it. And of course, the first part of this to really kick in any large degree was the Homestead Act. And so lots of folks, certainly during the Civil War, but after the Civil War, really began coming west. And that, of course, leads to, as we talked about yesterday, all sorts of issues between these newcomers and the natives that had been there for a long time. And so that's that. Now, what was life like for these folks that were that were coming west? Well, of course, it depended on who they were. Let's talk about some of the white settlers first, and then we'll talk about some of the freedmen called the exodusters in just a minute. The first group that are coming west, they come west to get their 160 acres, and then they find that this is a lot harder than was advertised. The advertisements were less than honest about how things would go out here in the West, and it was just very, very difficult. It was very lonely. These plots were very isolated in many cases, particularly for women, because women did not typically get to go to town like the men did because of the Victorian private and public spheres. And so women had a particularly hard time with all of this. Not that men didn't, but they generally had more opportunity for social interaction than women did. As a result of this, in 1867, the Patrons of Husbandry was started. This was known as the Grange later on, and that will become important as we move toward the 1890s and see the rise of a political movement that kind of comes out of this called the populist movement. And we'll talk more about that later and actually look at it as through the lens of L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. Some of the challenges that farmers faced was, besides the elements, besides no rain or too much rain or locusts or other infestations, that sort of thing. Another challenge that they faced were usurious practices by the railroads, particularly in short haul rates, meaning that to get their crops to market, they had to pay up to 10 times more than it would cost for that same amount of freight to be hauled all the way across the country. So this will lead to a desire for political change, and then eventually the Populist Party and some of what were called the Granger Laws, and we'll talk more about that. But that's a little overview of what was going on with the farmers, and this is a shorter video for today. I hope that all of you are doing well, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.